Let's take a moment and define what we mean by cutting and coning a torsion spring. When you look at a finished and complete torsion spring, you will notice the overall length of a certain diameter and wire-sized spring that has winding cone and stationary cones installed. The cones are actually wound into the spring. The cones have a threaded cut on them, allowing the spring to be wound upon it and then holding the cone into place. If you look closer at the end of the torsion wire, you can also see that the wire was cut. We are going to review how the wire gets cut and how those cones can be threaded into position. You might be asking yourself, why do I need to know this if a complete spring from the manufacturer already has everything installed on it? Well, there might be times where you have the correct spring on hand and you can still install it, but there are just as many times where you will need to alter or create a new spring from what you have in stock. As a manufacturer of springs, we have machines that can cut the ends of the wire, but we also cut them by hand using torches. Additionally, there are machines used to wind both cones on at the same time in a matter of seconds, which are not common for dealers to have on hand. When cutting and coning springs manually, you will need a spring spreader tool, a torch to cut the wire, a bench vise, winding bars, and a straight opener arm. When coning a spring, whether you are using an existing spring or a long length from stock, you have to cut the wire of the spring. The best and most common way to cut through the wire is using an oxygen and acetylene torch or something similar in heat and cutting ability. The wire needs to be heated and cut carefully without damaging the surrounding coils. This is where the spring spreader tool comes into play. Use the spring spreader tool to separate the last coil you are cutting away from the others. This allows for a clean cut that will not affect the other coils. Now with the spring cut the appropriate size and with good clean ends, we can start the cone installation process. The spring has to be securely mounted in order to wind the ends into the spring. This is very important as well as we will be applying a great amount of torque to the spring. We will secure the spring into a bench vise. It does not matter which end or cone you start with. Here we will start with our winding cone. The spring is secured in the bench vise with approximately 5 to 6 inches of the end exposed past the vise. The cone is wound into the opposite direction of the end wire. Our wire is pointing down, so we will be winding the cone up in the opposite direction. Start the cone by hand to follow the threaded grooves, then use the winding bars. Just like a regular spring installation, we will insert the winding bars into the cones and wind the cone onto the spring. Wind the cone to the end without over-winding it. Make sure you don't leave the wire too high or too low on the cone. With the winding cone complete, we can carefully release the spring, flip it around, and install the stationary cone. Again, leaving 5 to 6 inches of spring past the bench vise so we can insert the stationary cone by hand. Now we can wind the stationary cone. There are many ways to wind a stationary cone. One of the best and most common ways is to use a piece of straight opener arm. You place 2 3/8-inch nuts and bolts through the arm and into the stationary cone. Tighten the bolts and use the arm as a lever to wind the stationary cone into the spring. Again, the cone is installed correctly when wound up to the last thread, not over or under winding it. Once completed, you can take the spring out of the bench vise and inspect the entire spring for correct installation. You have now properly cut and coned your own torsion spring. Knowing this process is a valuable skill every garage door technician should acquire.